Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to the Analysis.news. In a few seconds, I'll be back with Boris Kagarlitsky. We're going to discuss the mood of the Russian people and just how might this war in Ukraine end. Please don't forget there's a donate button at the top of the webpage. We can't do this without you. On YouTube, please subscribe and then come over to the website. And everybody, please, if you're not already, sign up on our email list. Be back in just a few seconds. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in the Ukraine war, an illegal Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. I've said it before and I'll say it again. There was no imminent threat against Russia from Ukraine, which would have been the only justification for war. No doubt NATO and the US played a provocative role, and no doubt NATO should be disbanded. The US and NATO continues to escalate and avoid compromise, but that does not change who is the aggressor in this war. The dead includes tens of thousands of Russian workers, recruited mostly from outside the big cities. How will this monstrous war end? Now joining us is Boris Kagarlitsky. He's a well-known international commentator on Russian politics. Boris was a deputy to the Moscow City Soviet between 1990 and 93, during which time he was a member of the executive of the Socialist Party of Russia, co-founder of the Party of Labor, and advisor to the chairperson of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions of Russia. Previously, he was a student of art criticism and was imprisoned for 2 years for anti-Soviet activities. Boris's books include Empire of the Periphery, Russia and the World System, and Russia under Yeltsin and Putin, Neoliberal Autocracy, and New Realism, New Barbarism, The Crisis of Capitalism. In 2021, Boris was sentenced to 10 days in jail for sharing content on social media promoting unpermitted protests against results of Russia's recent parliamentary elections. In fact, if I have it right, Boris has the distinction of being put in jail by every Russian government since and including Gorbachev. Thanks for joining me again, Boris.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you, Paul.
So let's start with what is the mood of the Russian people. We're reading in the Western press that maybe 200,000 Russian soldiers have died. I don't know if that number is realistic, but they're saying it could be another 200,000. That's if the Western press is to be believed. And of course, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died, both women, children, volunteer soldiers, professional soldiers. What's the mood of the Russian people? Have they had enough of this?
I think the mood of the people is very confused. And of course, we have to understand that there are different people, there are different views, and there are different situations. Speaking about the numbers of casualties, I think maybe 200,000 is a bit too much, but it is really definitely above 100,000 and maybe 150,000. So we cannot count because their official bodies, the official institutions never give us any data. They stopped announcing numbers of casualties already for months. But at the same time, just you go to some provincial town, you see the cemeteries, and you just see that there are whole new sections at cemeteries, which are kind of specially dedicated to the victims of this war. They're expanding cemeteries. It's a very, very kind of tragic fact that just physically they're just doing a lot of work to expand cemeteries massively to give the ground for more bodies to be buried there. So it seems that there is also kind of a feeling that there should be more casualties soon.
In the 1960s and the early 70s, the Americans, I think, lost somewhere around 60,000 soldiers in Vietnam, and a very significant anti-war movement developed. Is there something like that developing in Russia?
Not exactly, for one reason. There is an anti-war movement, and it is strong enough, but there are two differences which we have to consider. One is that Russia today is a very authoritarian state. I mean, it's now much worse compared to what it used to be even 2 years ago. So in that sense, there is a lot of repression. There are quite a few people who are jailed, and there is a tremendous effort on the side of the authorities to suppress any kind of opposition media, any kind of opposition opinion. And if you protest actively, then you end up in jail immediately, just immediately. So there is no legal space for protest. And also quite a few people left the country. So we see massive exodus of people who were trying to avoid the draft. We have different data. Nobody calculated the numbers, but it is about 1 million people definitely who left the country just to avoid the draft. As you know, the government managed to draft about, there are different estimates because also they don't tell the real data, the real information. But anyhow, their estimate is that they managed to draft about 250,000 people for the army, and about 1 million at least left the country. So 5 times more than they managed to force into the army. Well, this is one side of the story. But there is the other side of the story, which is also very important. Who are those people who are drafted into the army? And here we come to the big social problem, partly understandable for the Americans, I think, because in the United States after the war in Vietnam, they also changed their policy, and they introduced what sometimes sociologists call the poverty draft, which means that they were trying to get into the army people from the depressed social layers, depressed areas, and so on. So for those groups, getting into the army sometimes is a good opportunity to earn money for their families. And this is exactly what is happening in Russia now, because once they're trying to press people in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Nizhny Novgorod or Irkutsk or Novosibirsk, these kind of urban modern centers, then every time there is a lot of resistance, people just disappear. They just leave the country, they leave their flats, and they run away. Well, there were cases of violent resistance, including one case of a military representative who was in charge of drafting people, was simply killed in Irkutsk by one of the people whom he tried to draft into the army, and so on and so on. And by the way, this guy who killed the officer is in jail, of course, because he did it openly. He just came to the office and shot at the officer. And now he's in jail, but they are afraid to put him on trial because the guy is so popular. If they put him on trial, there'll be hundreds of people who will come to the court rooms or to the court building to support the guy. So he is in jail, but there is no trial. But this is what is happening in big urban centers. And then you go to small villages, to depressed towns, also to some depressed regions of the country. And there you discover a completely different picture, because quite a few people say, okay, at least they're paying. So once you get drafted, it's a good news, because the family is going to get money. People were unemployed, or they had shitty jobs which didn't pay at all, and the families were in very bad shape. And then all of a sudden, when a boy, your son or your husband gets drafted, then the family gets money, and the economists even announced that in these areas, the economic situation, the income, the average income, increased visibly, and more. Also, there were cases, people were interviewed by sociologists, and the sociologists, of course, asked a quite reasonable question: "What about you getting killed?" And the answer, the most typical answer, was, "Okay, but that's also the good news because my family will get money for that. I'm going to die for my family. I will be ready to die for my family." Nobody says, almost no one says, "I'm going to die for Putin," or even "I'm going to die for Russia." They keep saying, "I'm going to die, if necessary, I'm going to die for my family. The family will get the money, and that will be a real support for that household." And at the same time, there are a lot of protests among the draftees and also among the families. But it is also shocking that quite a lot of protests among the families are about the cases when families don't get the money for the killed men. So that they were kind of expecting to get a lot of money. It's really a lot of money according to Russian standards. It's up to 6 million rubles for a soldier who died. It's a lot of money, really a lot of money.
How much is that in dollars?
Um, it's about $80,000 approximately. It's a lot of money. It's really a lot of money for poor Russian families. It's a real lot of money, and well, quite a lot of families don't get this money, of course, because they're trying to invent all sorts of ways to avoid paying, like saying, "Well, your son or husband missed an action rather than got killed. So we have no information. He was missing in action, and that means that you can keep it forever." We still don't have the information for everyone who was killed in the Second World War. We don't have all the names and so on. So they either say your son was not killed. He's
How long can this go on?
I don't know, but I think, well, the main problem is not with those people who uh, suffer directly from the war. That's the big problem. As I told you, there is enormous discontent, but this discontent is located in the uh, big cities with modernized and urbanized population. And of course, these cities are essential. They're important because also the majority of Russians are now living in these big centers. But at the same time, we still have quite a lot of people who are living in these depressed small towns and areas. It's about one third of the population of the country, approximately. And they face the worst consequences of the war, and at the same time, there are less protests, less discontent, and so on. So this is exactly the problem. So the most protesting, dissatisfied, the angriest areas are those areas which suffer the least from what was going on. And my feeling is that the popular discontent is not going to be the major problem. The major problem is elsewhere. The major problem is with the bureaucracy and, ironically, with the military themselves, because there are plenty of signals coming from the military, also from the security apparatus, and from the bureaucracy, that these are exactly the groups which are most angry, which are most unhappy with what's going on, and which are really interested in stopping, because the army is suffering enormous casualties, but it's also losing prestige. It's losing country. It's facing enormous blows, which are destroying the structure of the army. And also, this war is revealing the real weakness of the Russian military, which makes military extremely unhappy. and they really are interested in stopping it. They're really kind of saying enough is enough. We have to stop. We have to do something to reorganize the military apparatus, because the war revealed that Russian army is only a pale shadow of what it used to be historically. So we have to do something about it before doing anything else, before starting any new war. And also, well, they're not very happy with fighting Ukrainians anyhow, because many of them, they personally know their adversaries. Many of them used to serve in the very same Soviet army, or at least they used to study at the very same military academies, and so on and so on. So totally unhappy with this kind of war. So the military are the main opposition, and also it is very clear that now Putin is pushing the military to go into a new offensive, and there are rumors, which I think are correct, that the generals are doing everything to prevent that happening, because first they know it's not going to produce any results, and second, they don't want to do it anyhow.
The arms manufacturers are loving this. The Americans and NATO have been saying they'll stand on the principle of Ukrainian sovereignty until the last Ukrainian's dead, of course. This could go on for a hell of a long time. It's kind of a stalemate where people on both sides keep getting killed.
Not exactly. Not exactly. I don't think it's going to be a long stalemate. There is a stalemate right now, but it's not going to continue forever. First of all, yes, Ukraine is suffering a lot, but don't forget they're getting a lot of civilian casualties, which is not the case of Russia, and that makes the situation very different. So when the cities are bombed, when almost daily there are attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. Partly, by the way, it's not because it's a conscious decision of the Russian military, but partly because it's just it's a war. It's a war. You know, there is always this famous collateral damage. Remember, this is another American famous formula. So it's not always that Russian military want to hit civilian targets. There is a lot of collateral damage, but anyhow, there are civilians getting killed almost daily in Ukraine, and that makes the situation very different. And Ukrainians are forced to fight back. But I don't think it's going to continue forever, because, as I told you, the Russian military is unhappy. It seems that security services are not very happy with this either. And local administrative apparatus, the bureaucracy, are very unhappy. Also, the business is not happy with what's going on, because the economic situation is deteriorating very fast. So there is a growing lobby within their elite, within the state, against the war. And the main problem is not that Russian state is going to fight forever. The main problem is elsewhere. The main problem is that Putin himself and his closest entourage cannot find the way out. They cannot find the solution which is not going to damage their prestige and their political positions. And that is the main problem. And I think they're getting exactly what they deserved. But there are rumors that the elite, the broad elite, not the narrow elite around Putin himself, but the broad elite, which used to run the country and which is now getting less and less influential, because Putin is concentrating power in his hands. So this broad elite is not only unhappy, they're discussing how to get rid of Putin, so somehow. And I think if things continue the way they go, they will do it. They will do it. They'll find the way. Also, partly because Putin is ill, he's deadly ill, and of course, modern doctors, modern healthcare is really doing miracles. I think any other normal Russian citizen would have been dead already for years with the same diagnosis. But anyhow, there are different rumors that Putin can be declared so ill that he cannot carry out his duties as the president or something like that. So it seems they're discussing these things. There are very strong rumors, and there was just a joke, which is the practical joke, which is happening right now. Because in 1991, when there was an attempted coup d'etat, the famous GKChP, State Emergency Committee, which tried to replace Gorbachev, they started showing the ballet Swan Lake on Russian television. On every channel, there was the Swan Lake shown on every channel of Russian television. So the reputation of this great Tchaikovsky's ballet now in Russia is very specific. Every time you're going to say something about a possible coup d'etat, you are just using this metaphor that we want to watch watch Swan Lake. It's time for the Swan Lake to be shown, and so that's the kind of metaphor which is typical for Russia. Wait a minute. Typical for the Russian public. And now, what you discover that all over Moscow these days, all over Moscow, there is an announcement, which is true. I mean, it's not a joke. It's true. There is an announcement all over Moscow that on February 24th, there'll be a big show in the Kremlin. They're going to show the Swan Lake in the Kremlin.
And with the anniversary of the invasion,
they're really doing it. But you see these affiches, these posters all over the city, and everybody laughs and says maybe it's just an announcement, maybe they're just telling us something, maybe it's just a coincidence, but a very funny one. And it just shows you the mood, you see.
Now some people have said if there is a coup against Putin, it may not be someone who wants to end the war who comes to power. It could be forces who want to fight the war even more aggressively.
It's true that these forces exist. These forces are usually associated with the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the head of the private military company Wagner. But we have to understand, first of all, their real capacity, their military capacity is very limited. Yes, they have about 40,000 people, but mostly these people are concentrated in Ukraine at this point, and quite a few of them got killed, and more, there is an open conflict between them and the military. And the military are trying to undermine them by not supplying them properly with equipment, with the ammunition and so on. So actually, it's almost like a kind of war between the military and the Wagnerites. So they're trying to make the Wagner group pay the highest price possible for what's going on. And I think if there is a clash between the military and the groups like Wagner, the military will have the upper hand, definitely. They're much stronger and much better organized and much more motivated, by the way, because also these so-called ultra-patriots are also very confused and demotivated. There are lots of quarrels among them, and yes, some of them are very unhappy, but even among these people there is a growing mood that at least at this stage the war should be stopped. Maybe something has to be done. Maybe we have to start a new war soon. But not at this stage.
For progressive people outside Russia, outside of Ukraine, Americans, Canadians, Europeans, people from the South, what should they be demanding of their governments? Should they be demanding a push towards some kind of compromise, a way out for Putin and Russia? And of course, part of that argument is the more desperate Putin gets, that's assuming he's getting desperate, there may even be the possibility that he might actually use some kind of tactical nuclear weapon. I saw one Chinese editorial that's Global Times that actually said if Putin fears for his own life, that the kind of desperate measures could get very desperate. They didn't use the word nuclear weapons, but that was clearly what they were hinting at and were concerned about.
Well, I don't agree with that because I think, again, the military will not allow those so-called desperate measures. You see, you cannot use specific weapons without the agreement of those people who technically use these weapons. And it is very clear that the generals, at least some of the generals, are quite dedicated to stop the war. And if the war is going to be stopped, it's going to be stopped on our side, and it will be exactly the Russian military and security apparatus which is going to stop the war. How and when they will do it, this is a different story, because it's very difficult also. You can imagine, given the kind of state we have, also given the fact that these people are really patriotic, they're not going to undermine the real security status of the country, but they're quite dedicated to at least to some kind of way out to be discovered, and the solution will be found on this side, on our side. Speaking about the West, you see, the problem is that all kind of compromises which are acceptable for Putin are compromises which are unjust in their very nature, in the sense that they have to give Putin the way to present this war as a victory, at least to some extent, and to consolidate the regime, which will be the worst thing for Russia possible. You see, if this regime gets reconsolidated again after what happens, it's going to be the most tragic outcome for Russia, which you can only imagine. So in that sense, the defeat of Putin is definitely a better outcome for the Russian society, for the Russian people, than his victory. And it doesn't mean that we have to support the Ukrainian government and the West, because we know pretty well that the Ukrainian government is almost as oligarchic as the Russian government. And it is definitely the government which is responsible for quite a few injustices and quite a few things which we should never support. And in that sense, it's not a kind of war when we can say that these are the angels fighting the devils or something like that. But we also have to remember that this time it was the Russian government which started the war, which launched the attack, and which occupied the territory of our neighbor. And this is also very important. I just have to remind that in 2014, I was critical of the Ukrainian policy of military intervention in Donbass. I think it was not only wrong, it was a criminal policy, because they started the war. They were responsible for their impressive number of casualties on both sides and so on. There were ways to solve the problem easily with peaceful means, or at least there were ways to develop this conflict without killing people and so on. So in 2014, I was absolutely negative about what Ukrainian government was doing, even though I had no illusions about what was Russian government doing on its side. And this time, it's the other way around, for me at least. It's the other way around. I know pretty well that Ukrainian government is not deserving much of my sympathy, but this time it is Putin and his entourage who started the war, who are responsible, and in some way or another they have to be punished. And of course, I think they have to be punished by the Russian people and the Russian society, and hopefully by the Russian military in one way or another. I think it's going to happen. And in that sense, what the Western left should do, what progressives should do in the United States and Canada and in Western Europe, first of all, they have to support the peace movement in Russia, first and foremost. The peace movement exists. And by the way, there is still a serious development of some kind of underground media, of informal media, and so on and so on. So the official media is completely closed down. I mean, the opposition media is closed down, but we have a very strong presence online, on YouTube, up to the point that now Putin's deputies in the Duma discussing closing down YouTube at all, and probably closing down the internet at all, which will be technically, economically a disaster. And so far they failed to do that. But I mean, there is a movement. There is a very strong tendency and a very strong presence of those people who are against the war. Of course, quite a lot of people left the country, but there are plenty of people who are inside the country who are not afraid to speak out, as our Rapcore YouTube channel speaks out against the war almost daily, and we're still here, and we continue. We have problems, as I told you before. We have quite a few problems, but we continue to operate, and we will continue to operate.
One of the slogans that's being given amongst some of the anti-war movement in the U.S. is Russia out of Ukraine and put an end to NATO. What do you think of that?
Well, I agree. I should say more. I think it's not only that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. I think NATO and all military blocs should be dissolved for good. You see, that should be our end goal, at least. It's not that there should be some kind of military bloc around Russia or China against another bloc around the United States of America. We have to fight to dissolve all the military blocs of that kind. And by the way, that can be the long-term outcome of these confrontations now, because you see, even if Russia gets defeated and leaves Ukraine, the question has to be solved in the sense that you have to have some sort of peace and security conference for Europe or Eurasia. There should be some kind of long-term solution, maybe like the new Viennese Congress, which, as you remember, was in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars and so on, because there should be some kind of long-term decision about guaranteeing peace and security for everyone. And it's not going to be achieved just through the victory for one side. Even if one side wins, there should be some kind of long-term negotiated settlement for the world and for Europe and so on. But there is one more point I wanted to stress, speaking about Western progressive and Western left, because there is one very dangerous tendency also in Ukraine, in the West, and, by the way, among Russian liberal or right-wing immigration, who are blaming all Russians for what's going on. They're going to try to present Russian society and Russian people as being responsible for the war, for the crimes committed, for Putin and so on, which is totally unjust. We know that there is a lot of resistance. We know that the main victims of what's going on are Russians at this point. And also, it's absolutely absurd to pretend that Russian culture is to be blamed for what's going on. Russian language is to be banned, and so on and so on. It's absolutely disgusting, I think. And we have to resist that. We have to fight back, because this whole idea of collective responsibility, first of all, it is unjust to those who resisted these policies, but it's also a way to somehow save those who are really responsible. You see, there are always individuals and social groups which are concretely responsible for what is happening. And instead of saying that every Russian is to be blamed, every Russian is to be somehow punished for what's happening, you should say, no. It's not about every Russian. It's about particular, concrete individuals and groups which have to be punished at some point.
The last time I interviewed you, there was an advisor to Zelensky who you were somewhat positive about. and he'd been speaking on Ukrainian television in the Russian language. And he was criticizing this attempt to vilify all Russians. But if I understand it correctly, he's now resigned and has been publicly critiquing Zelensky and the government for pursuing just this kind of Russophobia. What do you make of that?
Exactly. This is Alexei Arestovich. And by the way, some people see him as a potential president of Ukraine in the future. He's a very special personality because, of course, sometimes he says a few things which I will never agree with, and a few scandalous things also. He's a character, so to speak, you know. So in that sense, we should not just agree with everything he says, but the point is that he has a very strong position on Russian language, on Ukrainian ethnic Russians, and on Russia itself. So, because, well, he keeps saying that Russian language should stay as the second official language, or at least the second language in Ukraine. So Russian language should be defended. Russian speakers should have the right to speak their mother tongue, and Russian culture is essential for Ukraine itself, which is exactly right. Kiev was one of the historic centers of Russian culture. Quite a few Russian writers and poets, as you know, were born in Ukraine and in Kiev, and in that sense, Ukrainians have all the reasons to appropriate Russian culture as their own. Instead of rejecting it, they have all the reasons to say, this is our culture as well. This is our language as well. We have the same rights, the same claims for this language as Russia has. This language is no more Russian for the Russian state than it is for the Ukrainian society. And this is a very strong position of Arestovich. He keeps insisting on that, and he gets attacked. And also he keeps saying that there are positive tendencies in Russian society which should be encouraged. So on these issues, he has very, very progressive positions. But of course, sometimes I suspect that he is a kind of Ukrainian imperialist. Because sometimes when I listen to him, I have a suspicion that he wants some kind of Ukrainian empire to be built on the ruins of Russian Empire. This kind of approach is sometimes kind of visible in his speeches, including sometimes he is presenting Ukraine as a potential hegemon for the whole of Eastern Europe. So this kind of great Ukrainian empire to be built on the ruins of the Russian Empire. That's not the kind of approach I would be very happy with.
Last time we talked, and I think it bears discussing again because what I'm about to say hasn't gone away. There are people in the American left and European, certainly the global South, that primarily blame NATO for the war. China more or less takes that position, and it's essentially that Putin was provoked into the invasion. The 2014 coup, the talk about Ukraine joining NATO, although I think that was highly exaggerated, but still, there was a lot of conversation about it, and the argument gets repeated. The idea that the primary villain of this peace are the Americans, and Putin was responding to that. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I understand why this opinion is emerging, because Americans did a lot of terrible things to all sorts of places, and if you live in Asia or Latin America or Africa, you rarely face any problems with Russians. You face a lot of problems with American imperialism. So So American imperialism in this case will be your primary problem, much more than Russian imperialism. So Russian imperialism, whatever you call it, is a problem for the former Soviet Union countries, for the countries which were part of the USSR. For the Russian society itself, it's a major problem. Let's be clear. The main problem with Putin is for Russians, for Russian society, and so on. So in that sense, of course, that kind of approach is understandable, but unfortunately, it's not correct. It's not correct in the sense that one of the great problems with Putin's war is exactly that it is objectively strengthening American imperialism. It is objectively working against the traditional goals of peace movements, because objectively Putin gives the reasons, the arguments to those who want to strengthen NATO, who want to expand NATO, who want to expand military industries, and so on and so on. Because that's exactly how it works. Putin's responsibility, Putin's to Russian oligarchies' responsibility, their responsibility is that they actually destroyed much of the theological and moral grounds on which global peace movement and many progressive movements in Europe, at least, existed for years. So if not destroy, they undermine these moral grounds, because, of course, now it's not easy, and I think in many ways it's not possible to say, for example, we should not supply weapons to Ukraine just because we are for peace, because we know that the other side is not going to stop fighting. So stopping supplying weapons to Ukraine means just stopping supplying weapons to one side and making the other side continue fighting and bombing and so on. This is not possible. But on the other hand, if you're saying the opposite thing, like supply more weapons, develop military industries and so on, you're also doing a wrong thing, because you're playing into the hands of those people who are reactionaries, who are historically responsible for quite a few crimes against peoples all over the world. So in that case, most people, many of my friends also just prefer to keep silent, because they cannot say either thing, make either of these two statements, and which is very understandable. So who is responsible for that disaster? I think Putin, and not just individually Putin, the Russian oligarch, and these people in the Russian elite who launched this war, they are responsible. And also they are creating tremendous problems inside the Ukrainian society, because also they're playing in the hands of those who want to get rid of Russian language and Russian culture, who want to suppress the Russian minority, and so on. So also they're playing into the hands of most reactionary forces in the Ukrainian society. And I hope they will be punished for that by history. But I'm quite optimistic, because I think that Russian society is not dead. I'm sure that there are forces which are very much beneath the surface. They're very much invisible, but they are in existence. They exist. They're real, which will show themselves, and which will make us overcome that situation. And we have to change the situation inside Russia. It is possible. It will be possible. And I'm pretty sure that once the situation changes here, once the war is stopped from this end, then we'll see a completely different picture, because we have to start not only peace negotiations, we have to start a real work for a long-term peace settlement, not just with Ukraine, but for Europe.
In one of our earlier interviews, we talked about the climate crisis and how destructive it has already been in parts of Russia, especially in Siberia. A report came out recently from James Hansen, who's been one of the leaders, early leaders, warning people about the climate crisis. And he's now saying we're on our way to 10 degrees warming. Never mind 2, 3, 4. We're on our way to a world that is completely unlivable. The invasion of Ukraine, whatever you make of the reasons why it started, although I have no doubt, again, the primary responsibility is on Putin. But that said, there's no conversation going on at a global level of any significance about what to do about the climate crisis. And add to that, we're already into a period where there's virtually no nuclear arms reduction treaties of any kind. The one that's left is not functioning because there's no inspections taking place. Is any of this being talked about, debated in Russian media amongst the people? Is it in the consciousness of the people just how dangerous the world is getting? That, there's more of an existential threat than what's happening in Ukraine, assuming it doesn't go nuclear.
Well, honestly, I think people are much more worried about the war than about the climate change for the obvious reason. The war is taking place around us right now, and the climate change keeps being seen as something which is kind of postponed. It can and maybe will happen later. But, by the way, I should say that just before the eruption of the war, there were some interesting debates in Russian media about the climate change. And the debates were, in many ways, very positive. I think in many ways, even more positive than in Western countries. Because, first of all, the biggest question was what can be done positively, not in terms of kind of just, for example, limiting their production, but what can be done positively. And for example, there was a big debate about planting forests, mass planting of forests in Russia, and by the way, in Ukraine also. There were discussions in Ukraine about reforestation of the country. There was a plan to plant a few million, probably billion, even billions of trees in Ukraine and Russia, and that was discussed very seriously among the experts. And that was a very good idea because these are exactly the green jobs. The green jobs, in the most direct sense of the word, just planting forests. Russia faces deforestation, and we have to do something about it. It also became a real problem for us because it leads to the crisis with water, because rivers are getting shallow, and that also is creating quite a few problems. So there is an approach. Also, there was a very interesting discussion in the media about who's going to pay the price for the new Green Deal if we go forward with it, because in that sense, it's very interesting to quote an article, a brilliant article by a friend of mine, Nikolai Protsenko, who published it just a few, I think, weeks before the war, saying that yes to the Green Deal, definitely, but Green New Deal, but definitely we have to put the question, who is going to pay? There is a corporate agenda about ordinary people and working people being forced to pay the price for their environmental reforms. And the case with the yellow vests in France is very typical in that sense, that they were trying to make ordinary poor people to pay, while corporations were going to make profits out of it. So the argument made by Protsenko was very clear. We shouldn't allow a Green New Deal to become a corporate agenda, because the elites can make profits out of everything. They made profits out of destroying the planet, they can make profits out of saving the planet. It's always about profits. Of course, maybe it's better if they work on saving the planet. But again, the question is who is going to pay? It's a social, it's a class question, which should be put forward. And I really enjoyed this article. I think it's very essential. This way he put the question.
The other issue is what I mentioned. We're basically in a period now where there are no nuclear arms reduction treaties of any kind. There's a massive investment taking place in the U.S., and I know there certainly was a massive expansion planned in Russia. I don't know if they still have the money to do it, but both countries were planning to spend more than $1 trillion on modernizing their nuclear weapons. And I assume Russia's still going ahead with it. China is now much more expansive in their ICBM program, where they had been quite modest for decades. We're entering a period that Daniel Ellsberg and others think is actually more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is there any chance of getting some rationality into this situation, some kind of treaty negotiations in spite of what's going on in Ukraine?
It depends on what kind of government we are going to have within 2 or 3 years from now. Because if we get some kind of new government, which would be not necessarily more progressive, maybe it will be more progressive, by the way, but which will be at least more reasonable, then I think they will be interested in limiting a nuclear arms race for one simple reason. We have to rebuild the economy. We don't have much money. We can solve the problems, by the way. It shouldn't be said that there is no way we can get the resources to modernize and rebuild the economy. We will get these resources, even if Russia has to pay the reparations to Ukraine. Because, by the way, this is another irony of the situation. Because again, now some pro-Kremlin people say that, okay, we should not sign a peace treaty because a peace treaty would necessarily mean that we would be forced to pay the reparations for the destroyed infrastructure and buildings and everything which we destroyed in Ukraine. So it will be a tremendous cost which Russian economy and Russian society will have to pay. But the irony of the situation is that Imagine Russia won the war and occupied Ukraine. Who is going to pay for rebuilding the infrastructure and buildings? Russia is going to pay anyhow. And by the way, it will be more, because if we take the case when Russia leaves Ukraine, Russian state will have to pay the reparations, but the West will help. The West will at least be forced to spend some money on rebuilding Ukraine. If Russia occupies Ukraine, the West will not invest a single penny into rebuilding Ukraine. Then Russia is going to pay the whole cost of it. So in that sense, it's better to pay reparations than to pay for the so-called victory for Putin, which will be more costly for Russian economy. But coming back to the point of nuclear weapons, I should say that, first of all, it very much depends on what kind of government we're going to have. If we get a better government, or at least a government which is partly composed of the very same people, but with the very same people who are going to try to improve their reputation after Putin, which is quite possible. We're going to have the same bureaucrats who are going to say, okay, now we're good guys, we're not going to invade anyone anymore. We are going to be like the Weimar Republic in Germany, pretending that we are Democrats and good guys, then they will not be so much interested in the nuclear weapons. They will be interested in something else. They'll be interested in rebuilding the economy. They will be interested in improving their reputation abroad. And, limiting nuclear weapons for Russia in this case will be a very attractive option. Because it allows to save money instead of spending money on the weapons which no one goes to use. At least, hopefully, no one is going to use. It's a useless equipment because every time you try to use it, you are inflicting damage on yourself. You're inviting others to use the same weapons on yourself, which is stupid, among other things. It's just stupid. And that used to work in the Cold War times in the sense that there were weapons which were existing not to be used, but they guaranteed peace because they guaranteed, at least from this logic of mutual destruction, they guaranteed peace among two big blocs. But now the problem is that we don't have these two big blocs, and we have a much more complicated picture. And in that sense, using nuclear weapons, on the one hand, there is a temptation to use nuclear weapons on the third party, so to speak, on somebody who, for example, who does have the nuclear weapon and so on. But in the long run, it's even more dangerous, because it's like opening the Pandora box, which brings up all sorts of terrible consequences. So I think, again, Russian government after Putin quite possibly may start talking about nuclear disarmament. It's pretty possible on the Russian side, but only as long as we do the other things. We have to get rid of Putin. Somebody. There is no way I can influence these situations. Somebody at the very top has to solve the problem in one way or another. Then they have to reform the government, present it as a kind of new government. Most probably, the new government will be very much the same old government, with a few new faces, but trying to present itself as the new beginning or something like that. I'm sure the West will agree with that, because they will love to have the old bad guys, the same old bad guys again, calling them the new bright democratic figures, as they already did a few times with other countries. But then what Russian progressives should do is trying to influence the situation, trying to put pressure on these governments in order to go into much more serious reforms, also in terms of peacemaking, in terms of disarmament and so on. So I think disarmament is the solution. If you don't want any more wars, you have to disarm. This is the obvious answer. Not to arm yourself to the teeth, but to disarm.
All right. Thanks very much, Boris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
Let's do it again soon.
Yeah. Don't forget to remind about Russian Descent Substack.
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead and explain that to people.
Okay. Also, if you want to follow what Russian opposition, especially Russian left, is doing and saying, what's happening here in Russia, please subscribe to Russian Dissent on Substack. I sent Paul the link. It's a subscription which is paid, but it's not a lot of money, and the money goes also to support some of our activities abroad, which are essential for us. So it will be also the way to support the Russian left and Russian anti-war movement.
And you're publishing in English?
Yes. Yes, it is done in English. It's specially designed for the English language audience, and we are trying to translate some of the best publications, some of the publications of Rapcore. So these are the ones which we produce for our Western readers. So the publication we translate into English for our Western readers, and soon we will start also doing videos, which of course we do in Russian, but with English subtitles. With English subtitles, you will be able to understand what we are talking about, what's happening.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. Again, please don't forget, we can't do this without your support. There's a donate button at the top of our webpage. If you're on YouTube, come on over to theAnalysis.news. I think there's links below the video on YouTube. You can also get on our email list. That's the best way to keep up with what we're doing. YouTube, subscribe. If you're on the podcast, subscribe to the podcast platforms. And you can watch and listen to everything from the website. And that might even be the best, given that YouTube often messes with us. At any rate, thanks again for joining us.